Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this session on ocean conservation and social development. We're going to wait a little bit to see whether a few more people join us before introducing our panelists today. So do bear with us for another minute or so. We'll start within a minute. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on ocean conservation and social development. We have a panel joining you from all around the world. We have myself, Eddie Allison, from the UK and Italy originally, currently joining you from Malaysia. Gildas Andrea Malala, who is from Madagascar, but joining us from the UK. Beatriz Mesquita, joining us from Brazil, I believe. And David Obura, who I think is in Kenya at the moment. Is that correct? Yes. Thanks for joining, to you for joining us. We're all in slightly different time zones, so feeling the effects of the day in different ways, but very happy to have this group assembled of distinctive and distinguished voices in the integrated conservation and development world related to oceans and coastal communities. So I'd like the panelists to introduce themselves briefly. I'll start with myself. My name's Eddie Allison. I'm a fisheries scientist and international development scholar practitioner. I work for an organization called World Fish, one of the members of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, with a mission to use aquatic food systems to help eliminate poverty, hunger and malnutrition. We're an international non-profit. I'll ask Gildas to introduce himself next. Gildas, you're muted. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Good morning and good afternoon again, everyone. And thank you very much, Professor Eddie, for having us together here, for the invitation also from the organizer of the conference. I'm Gildas Malala. As Eddie said, I'm based here in the UK, but I am from Madagascar. I work for an organization called Blue Ventures Conservation. My job is a technical advisor for governance and capacity building. And our mission basically is working with coastal communities, mostly in poor and developed countries, trying to help restore fisheries, but also to improve coastal communities' livelihood at the same time. Yeah, that's pretty much me. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gildas. Beatriz?
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Professor Allison and the organizers to invited me here. I am talking from Brazil, so it's day here, mid of the day, and I am settled in the Northeast because Brazil is very huge, so we have to say where we come from. I come from Recife in the Northeast. I work for a foundation called Joaquim Nabuco, and we have the mission to do social research and also cultural development in this region, in Brazil. I've been working with artisanal fishers for my life because I did fishing engineer at university, and then I entered more in the social research. So that's me. And I am also from ICSF, the International Collective for a small-scale fisher. I try to put my knowledge here in Brazil to help in international movements like that. So that's me. I hope I can help to the discussion and to show what we did here in Brazil.
Thank you, Beatrice. And finally, David.
Thank you, Eddie, and good day, good evening to everybody on the call. And thanks to the organizers for bringing me into this panel. It's a pleasure to be talking to you on this topic. My name is David Obura. I'm a coral ecologist working on the coast of Kenya, and I'm from Kenya. I studied in the US, know a little bit about Yale. I went to a sister college to the north, which was one notch better, but I won't mention which one. It's now I've really been working in coral reef research for 30 years now, really, and turning that into really trying to understand sustainability issues. How do we address people's needs? How do we try and balance the environment and people's needs and economy on the planet that we have moving into the coming decades? So I think the discussion here on conservation and its place is a very important one. So very pleased to be here with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to those of you who shared something of your origins and interests in the chat. Anyone who hasn't, please do so. It's great to hear who we're talking with as well, and you'll have a chance to ask the panel some questions later in this session. But I want to move through to our sort of introduction to this session, and I'd like David, if you wouldn't mind, sort of leading us on this, and the other panelists, feel free to add to David's introductory remarks. Why, David, is ocean conservation important, and what's perhaps distinct about it in the broader environment and societal development agenda?
Thanks, Eddie. So that's a big question, and I'm happy to sort of lead into it with some of my insights. But I'm sure Gildas and Beatrice and Eddie and others will have a lot to say on this. I think the role of conservation is critical. I think it's such an important field, and it's a very misunderstood field. And I'll come back to that sort of in the end of my little introduction. I think the ocean is important for many different reasons. It's 3/4 of the Earth's surface, and I think 90% or more of the living biosphere. And really the origins of life were in the ocean. It's of course a long time ago, and the type of diversity you find in the ocean is very different from on land. But what that also means is that, for example, the planet's climate has evolved very much in interaction with the ocean. We're only just really understanding that now as we're seeing climate being tipped out of its comfort zone, how critical the ocean, the living parts of the ocean, also living sort of biosphere on land is for that. So we really need to understand it. We need to see that it connects us rather than separating us. And that's even more important as the planet becomes more and more crowded. Now, we tend to work, and I think a lot of our discussion in this panel will be around the coastal zones and communities and interactions in the coastal zone. The coastal zone is particularly important. It's a very narrow strip of land and sea, ringing the oceans or ringing the continents, depending on which way you want to look at it. And everything sort of comes together in the coastal zone. People come from inland areas, water flows downhill, and everything sort of comes to the ocean, and ocean processes come towards the land. So it's really a critical nexus as we move into the coming decades. We talk about the Anthropocene and the degree to which humanity is changing the dynamics of the planet. And I think the coastal zone, the ocean conservation will play an increasingly important role in the balance coming into the future. The coastal zone is home to many people, many of whom are low income or live with quite traditional lifestyles or live through subsistence means. They're very dependent on the health of ecosystems, the health of ocean and land systems at the coastal zone. We work a lot with fishing communities in East Africa, as does Gildas. I'm sure he'll talk a lot about that. But there are many other sectors of society that are very dependent on the health of the ocean and the coastal zone. So the tourism industry, we tend to think of tourism as being in beautiful places, meaning a clean environment, a healthy ecosystem. But in many places, tourism creates its own environment, and that can do a lot of damage to the natural systems. And so we need to be quite conscious of that. And many of the growing cities on the planet are in the coastal zones as well. In Africa alone, moving into the end of this century, Africa will have a large proportion of the megacities on the planet, and most of those will be in the coastal zone. So we really need to understand how we deal with people and the environment together. My work is really beginning to focus a lot on conservation, not just in protected areas or in very natural, semi-pristine or almost pristine places, but in conservation in nature where people live, because it's in those places where the functions from nature, the ecological functions, the provision of food, the clean water and things like that, they depend on those ecosystems being healthy, and conservation has a critical role in really maintaining the health of these natural systems and therefore the benefits that people get. So I think really moving into the coming decades, this issue of conservation in shared spaces, of conservation in working landscapes and seascapes becomes increasingly important. And the challenge there is that, of course, many people are very dependent on, for example, fishermen, on going out and catching fish for food. And if there's a high population, there's high pressures on the sea, it's very hard to get people to pull back that pressure because they depend on that for their food, for their income, to send their children to school, to pay for their healthcare and to buy their food. And so really understanding how we can maintain, how do we pay for the maintenance of ecosystems, and how do we make conservation work for people in these places. And I think that's my final point then, coming back to these places, is thinking about, what's the true cost of business? What's the true cost of the economic activities that we have? And I think our processes so far have been very much extractive, very linear processes of take something from the environment, use it, process it, discard it, and then it becomes a waste product and can do damage in the environment. We really have to understand how to turn these into circular processes. A big part of that, thinking about the point of this conference and philanthropy, is really understanding what's the true, where should the money come from in order to make this system work. And there are many sources. Philanthropy is particularly important. Governments and international aid are very important. But then really understanding how to internalize all of these costs into business practices so that businesses are paying for to maintain the system that they depend on, and that we're all paying our fair share to really make the system work. And at the moment, a lot of our conservation work is really focusing on, trying to make conservation work where people are very desperate, where there's communities, small-scale fishers, small-scale food producers on land, really trying to reduce their vulnerability so that they have a bit more, and then we try and rebalance the system so it works for all. So that, I think, is, in a nutshell, coming to this issue of the ocean and conservation, and what's the importance of conservation coming into the decades ahead. I think that's the way I very much see it. So I'll hand it back to you with that, Eddie. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David, for that brilliant sort of sweep through and summary of a big question. And I think you posed us really the fundamental question that we're going to be asking in the next part of this discussion, which is, how do you make conservation work for people? And the next part of our session will be on scalable solutions, practical approaches, projects for ocean conservation and social development. And you also sort of hinted at two possible solutions in that. Moving from linear to circular economies, or ways of thinking about our interactions with the environment, and how to incentivize businesses to pay for the ecosystem services that support them, many of which they're currently getting for free and potentially imposing costs on that others who then depend on those systems end up paying. So the distribution of costs and benefits needs to be changed in order for integrated conservation and development to work. So, there's two areas already that we can work on. I want to come to Beatrice next to ask what you see as a particular feature of ocean and coastal conservation that makes it different to land-based conservation. Is there an extra challenge, or is it easier? What are the features that either make it easier or more difficult than land-based conservation?
I think it's not easier. I think it's more difficult, but they are interrelated. I think they are together. And for example, this week in my region, we are having a big problem to small-scale fishers because a harbor dredging that took off many garbage from the mud, and fishers can't fish because there are too many plastic on the ocean. So there is a big relationship in the coastal area with earth and ocean. I think the coastal area, it's difficult. It's more difficult to do the actions. But we have in the coastal science and in the coastal management, we have to look directly to the earth, because like rivers took everything to the coastal area. So to us here in Brazil, and our public policies are not too relation. There is not a big relation like with coastal management policies and earth public policies. So for me, this is the most important now to do this relation.
Thanks, Beatrice. I think a very practical illustration of one of the points David made earlier about what happens on land ending up in the sea. And I think land-based societies seeing the sea as a place to dispose of waste products, whether it's excess nutrients or plastics or pollutants of other kinds. And of course, they're being poured into the people's workplaces, people's homes, and the places where people get their food and sustenance. And so that's one of the critical challenges. And the fluidity, what helps to diffuse and dilute pollution, helps to diffuse and spread contamination as well. So the key challenge in ocean conservation there.
And nobody planned this, because when the harbor planned the dredging, they never think that small-scale fishers can be affected. So there is no consult, there is no discussion about that. They can do this dredging in another season, because now is fishery season is in high. So we have to plan this together. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Gildas, we often hear about in land-based conservation that traditional users of land, forests, rangelands, etc., are stewards of the environment and could be regarded as conservationists and among the most effective partners for conservation. Is that the case for coastal communities, for fishing communities as well, in your experience?
Thank you, Professor Eddy. Yes, very much so. As just coming back again to what David mentioned earlier, the dependence is so high in many places on the marine resources and fisheries. And places where I worked these last 15 years, for example, mostly Madagascar and the Southeast Asia. But in Madagascar, pretty much more than 90% of the population rely on the sea. And I think that's illustrated in the recent report that you, Professor Eddy, contributed to, the eliminating the hidden harvest of how many people rely on small-scale fishers around the world, something like 500 million or something like that, I think. And in Madagascar, it's no different. And those are very poor people, of course, very poor people. For example, numbers in Madagascar, it's on average less than $2 a day, the income of the fishers that we work with. And that's not just that. Talking about the impact of the inland, what's going on, the social problem inland, like in Madagascar, for example. We have the drought there in the south of Madagascar. It's something all around the news around the world. And that results in migration to the coastal area. And that has a big impact. The agricultural problem, the agricultural failure from inland has a big impact of the coastal area. And we know that those communities are very vulnerable to adapt to those kind of changes, to the social change, economic change. And again, 2 weeks ago, Madagascar was hit by a cyclone. And once things like that happen, it's very hard for people to adapt to the changes because people in the sea, they are used to find something day to day. They are not used to the long-term saving because they have the sea there to rely on. And those are the problem out there. But to make things work, you need that stewardship from people from the ground because they are the closest to the problem and they could be also the one closest to the solution, which is something that we've considered a lot these last decades on how to integrate community, involve community to be in the to be the driving force, basically, of marine conservation. And as you said, we'll talk about it in the second part of this session, but it's pretty much the same in places like Madagascar, Southeast Asia, or many places in the global south, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Gildas. I think you've reinforced the interconnectedness of what happens on land and sea. You can't consider these to be separate arenas, that conservation activities have to take into account, as do development activities, the interactions between inland and coastal environments, but also people. In the case study of drought-induced migration, that people move through these different systems, as well as nutrients and materials and organisms. So integrated land water conservation is we can add that potentially to our key bank of solutions. So let's turn now to those solutions, and I'm going to ask you all if there's sort of one practical approach that you have come across, perhaps in a particular community or place that you're familiar with and work with, that you feel, if it was more widely adopted, would lead to a transformative change in our relationship with the ocean, to an improvement in both conservation outcomes and social development or human well-being outcomes. So what's practical and, in your view, scalable if we did more of it, invested more in it, in that kind of solution. So I'll start with Beatrice this time. And, you know, if you feel that there aren't solutions, or that certain kinds of popular solutions are not working, you know, also feel free to add a critical perspective. I think we don't want to be naive and utopian. We want to be optimistic and find solutions, but we also want to acknowledge difficulties and stumbling blocks, and perhaps you know, mistakes that have been made as well.
Yes, I think knowledge is the first thing to lead to conservation feelings and conservation thinking. Education, and to know the process and the importance of the species and of the system and everything is the most important. So environment education for me is the best thing to start with some kind of process to ocean conservation. Like here, in our coastal area, it's not only fishers. I'm not talking about fishers because they know very much, but local people and tourists and people that are users from the environments. Most of them don't know the importance of the environment. So in my place, I live in a tropical, very beautiful beaches area, and this tourism here is very high now. It's like the Caribbean in Brazil. So for us, people that come to the communities to stay on the beaches, they are the less knowledge people about the ocean system. And they are on holidays, and they really don't like to thinking about this kind of importance. So I think this relation with tourism and information is very important in my region. And for the other side, community tourism also, I think it can be a big friend from conservation, because we have big resorts and big financial groups that comes from Europe, that comes from US to invest here in tourism on the coastal area. And these people don't have the day-to-day life in the coastal, so it's very difficult to invest in some kind of conservation tourism, ecotourism. This ecotourism that is not really eco, it's more to say something to the society. So I think the community knows, the community live there in the place. They don't want to do economic activities that will harm their place. They have cultural feelings. They have other kind of feelings to the territory. So I think community tourism in our place is one thing that can work together with ocean conservation. Yes, what I can say that I think is that, Alison.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point. And when you consider that apparently around half of global tourism revenue is generated in coastal areas, that, you know, these are major destinations for large parts of humanity, as well as the increasing coastal populations David mentioned earlier, if you can make those visitors and those urban coastal residents more ocean literate, I think is the word that people are starting to use, then that's certainly a scalable solution to some of the problems of neglect due to lack of awareness and lack of perhaps interest in the state of the oceans. So thank you for that. That we can certainly add that to our sort of bank of scalable solutions. David, what would you where would you invest your money in a scalable solution?
What would I invest my money?
Or philanthropic money, indeed. If it's not, it doesn't have to be your own.
No, I think what I'm increasingly seeing, and I think we're really strongly advocating now, certainly in Eastern Africa where I live, is that really to have a local focus, because there are very big and consistent problems around the world. I think we do understand a lot of them very well from the scientific point of view and from a management and technical perspectives. And often there is very good local knowledge in communities. Of course, that is eroded with modernization and people moving into the coast from upland areas and things like that. But we really have to see that the local focus is essential. This really means essentially asking people, what do they want and how would they like to implement things in their areas. I think we certainly understand that we've exceeded the footprint of the planet. We're going beyond planetary boundaries, is a phrase that's used. We need to improve the state of nature and expand conservation actions. But how do you do that? And you need to consult locally to identify how that can work in the local context and who benefits, who has to give up a little bit. How do you address the different interests, and particularly around rights and equity, so that those who have least either are paying the least cost or else have benefits flowing to them because of the inequalities around them. And I think a lot of the conservation planning, and this comes from the sector that I'm primarily in as a scientist, is very much about telling people what to do. We do big analyses, we optimize solutions, and then we come in and say, well, in this area, this is what you should do. And often that's not grounded in the realities of the place. And often if the communities and others with good local knowledge are asked for their opinion on how to implement something, a better solution can be found. Certainly one that socially is much better, and often one that may in fact be better biologically or ecologically as well. So really turning the focus towards the local in all things, in empowerment, in addressing rights, in understanding what needs to be resourced and how, and making the systems work around that. And the other part of that, which Beatrice mentioned in talking about tourism, the difference between locally based and community tourism, and this very transnational tourism of large corporations setting up resorts and businesses in other places and tourists flying in for these experiences, often very much contrary to local ecological sustainability or to local customs and cultures and things like that, is that we need to shift that. We really need to understand that I guess we're very concerned about population density, the number of people on the planet, and that's right. But the elephant in the room that we haven't been addressing, but I think is becoming increasingly clear, is that this overconsumption and overuse of fossil fuels and energy, excess use of plastics and the waste that's associated with that. We really need to work out how to reduce these consumption levels. I think one way to do that is to focus on the local, what's really needed locally. You work out how to sustain communities and people in a place. And then, so there might be some export from that. There might be some goods and services will go outside or tourists will come inside, but it has to fit the local area. And so we work in that with fishing communities around conservation. So establishing locally managed marine areas, trying to see how, if we're trying to protect parts of the sea, how do you make it so that the fishing community is actually the steward of that process and is in charge of that process, rather than always feeling that they are being pushed out by conservation or by a government agency or by a tourism resort or something like that. So I think that local focus is really the most important. And it's working very well in many places, and Gildas will give some great examples of that. But it's hard to do, and we really need to invest to really be able to do it well.
Yeah, thank you, David. A really important point. I think that it requires a sort of reversal of existing power relations. I think it's often conservation solutions are conceived at quite a high level, and one approach to scaling is, I've developed something great, and I'm going to sort of take it around the world and sell it and try and get other people to sort of buy into this solution. Where what you're suggesting is, instead of coming with your solution, ask what the local solution is and how you can help implement it.
And if
multiple places, I guess. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just finish that thought, because I didn't quite get to the one that's building on what you just said, is the way to scale. It's very hard for an organization to, you might be able to implement something in 5 places, but how do you scale to 20 or 100? But if you really build the solution around local empowerment, then you already have the unit in place locally. Then it's a need of, you have to have the resources and building the education, like Beatrice said, and really the support system to help all these local places do their own thing right. I think that's really the solution to scalability.
Excellent. And that's a great segue to move on to Gildas, your sort of scalable solution approach.
Yeah. I think thanks a lot, David, for opening that, giving the broader picture. But on my side, I can just explain and present some case study on how we start with communities focusing on local in Madagascar in order to scale and replicate throughout the countries. Coming back to what you said, back in 2000, maybe 4 or 5 in Madagascar, we came as a conservationist, introducing marine conservation to communities by introducing the idea of protected areas, for example, of if you close certain areas of, let's say, coral reef, and for many, many years you will reproduce and so on. But that idea wasn't well received by local communities because it was too theoretical and it was hard to implement, really. And we came back a bit and consult better with communities about what could be the approach. And that's how everything started in the southwest of Madagascar with the octopus fisheries management. And I saw someone in the chat was octopus's favorite animal. So here we go. That's how everything started in only one little village called Ndavadok in Madagascar, where we started managing octopus. And octopus, it's a fast growing species, really. And it's a very economic, and there's a very importance economically, the value for local community. And that's where we started, closing together with the community, designated one area for closure for 3 to 6 months. And the result was astonishing, basically, the result of the harvest during the opening of the 6 months. And so the lesson here is implementing something that makes sense for local communities, something they understand, something they can feel a tangible benefit for community. But that's only one village. But Madagascar is a huge island. There is so much potential. And that's how we started spreading the approach and start communicating communities through learning exchange, peer exchange amongst fishers all around the southwest of Madagascar and up to the north. And now, years later, after 10 years later, all of those areas implement the same approach. And if it doesn't work for octopus in some areas, they do it for crab, for example. And at the moment, we talk of 15 years later, we talk about 170 communities in Madagascar alone doing the same thing. And even fishers from Mexico, from Indonesia are learning the same approach because they have the same fisheries, basically. And the LMMA that locally marine managed area David O'Rourke was talking about earlier is spread all around the Western Indian Ocean with the same approach starting from the community. But that doesn't work, of course, if you don't give the community that right to manage. The Madagascar is an open access fisheries, and that's very difficult for community to take in hand if you still have a threat from the outsider, like industrial fishing or let's say the tourism development that Beatrice was talking about earlier. So you have to give that power for community to manage. And at the same time as the NGO, the technical support, it's something, what we've learned is it takes time. It's a long process. And I guess that's my message for the philanthropist, to be, the patience is there. It takes time. You need to invest in capacity building for local community to take everything in their hands. But sometimes we tend to think more about innovations most of the time, trying to think about, most people like fund innovation. But sometimes it's not about the innovation. It's about what you've built a long time ago and make it last and scale it. And that's not innovation. That's just building on what works already and scale it. So I guess that's one of my message. But the second one, I guess, is invest in those local organizations, the local community, the local organization that implement it in the field. Because I think we can have a bigger impact if we invest more in those people that are the one in very close to the solution down there. Yeah, I think that's all I want to share really on that question. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Gilda. Some important practical lessons from the field, but also some, I think very philosophical points about the nature of, how philanthropy and external agents look at the process of conservation, and the emphasis on, innovation and disruption and these kinds of processes, the things that have made, some parts of our industry, tech industry, for example, extremely successful. Moving fast, having short timescales. Things if it doesn't work in 2 years, move on to something else. And the message I think that you're sending is that in conservation, in communities, have more faith in longer term process. Recognize that complex problems can't always be solved with a new, a new silver bullet, a new gizmo, a new app. And that investing in these sort of local differentiated solutions, local rights, organizational capacity, it's longer, it's messier, it's perhaps less glamorous, but maybe it's more durable and maybe it works. I mean, that's a question that maybe we can pick up and discuss later. So I think, you've outlined, I think, from your experiences, scalable solutions that would work. I think before going to questions from our audience, and I would remind those watching, if you have some questions for the panel, please do type them up so that we have a chance to look at them and call on them when we go to questions in a few minutes' time. Before we do that, however, I would like to ask again just one more round with the panel. This time, a focus on the future. The future priorities. Having looked at the lessons that you've examined, if you had, one sort of future. Something that hasn't been tried, perhaps something that you think is promising, that's emerging, that you see as having potential in the future. I realize this takes us somewhat into innovation, Gilda, and apologies for that. Your point is acknowledged, but as well as the tried and tested solutions, is there something new that has not yet been tried that you feel is promising? And I'm going to let whoever wants to answer that answer rather than ask all of you to do that. If you would prefer not to answer that, or just to think on it, then do so. So I'll just ask whoever wants to have a go at that to offer a viewpoint.
Okay, well, I don't mind having a go at that. I'll try for it quickly. And I think one thing is, so it's certainly a new perspective. It's not doing new things necessarily, but one of the guidances we're coming up. So this year, it should have been 2020, we're finally coming up with new global targets for conservation, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And one of the angles we're really pushing from an African perspective is that there is science that shows that, where people are living in farmlands, where pastoral lands, where people are herding and so on, if you can ensure that at least 20% of the landscape or seascape is in very good health, is intact ecologically, so good forest, good grassland, good ocean ecosystems, that provides a lot of services to people and also sustains nature. And so in degraded areas, I think really seeing that if we can invest and get people, if you have a large farm or a farming landscape, is to pull back from 10 to 20% of that landscape and restore nature in it, along the edges of rivers, little forest pockets and things like that, then that will really make a huge difference to people living in that space and also to conserving ecosystems and species and so on. I think that's a grand challenge in those really altered places that are so common now around the world, is to really improve nature in those places.
Thanks, David. The process is sometimes known as set aside, rewilding, restoration in various terrestrial contexts, and interesting to hear that could be an approach that we should be thinking about and using more in coastal and ocean systems as well. Beatrice.
Yes, I'm thinking here in small-scale fishers. That in the pandemic time, we are having many troubles in small-scale fishery, but we can see a longer way to marketing, because I think now we saw in the pandemic that this long value chain that small-scale fishers see can be shortened, and local sellers can continue, because we saw, I think, in all the world, in the communities, that they start to sell in the internet, in local cities and everything, things that for a long time they never tried to change. So I think this is one important thing that we had to continue and to invest in it. And maybe projects now knows that this can be done, that the value chain can be changed. And I don't know where in Africa, but here in Brazil, the middleman stays with many half of the price of the value of the fish. So this is a big and old problem in the chain. I think this is one thing that I can see in a longer way to change.
Thank you, Beatrice. Gildas, did you want to add?
Yes, add some more innovation. Yeah, innovation is great. We all agree. Don't get me wrong, but it's the balance basically that we need to look at. And on that term, things, for example, how we can improve the link between the community initiatives and businesses that was mentioned earlier, how we can link, how we can use each other to as a win-win situation, basically win-win for example, in the Philippines where I used to work on seaweed farming, which is a business, right? And it's the same in Madagascar and in East Africa also, how we can use those kind of businesses as an incentive for community to engage in conservation, or as something, if you can implement some sort of a result-based approach or effort-based approach and linking both and get the same result, a positive result, basically both economically and for the business and for the environment. And a case is also, for example, in Madagascar at the moment, we try to establish something we call the fishing observatory. It's kind of a platform, basically. As we all know in Madagascar, the difficulty for the government to enforce the legislation and to protect, for example, communities against, let's say, illegal industrial fishers and stuff like that. So we implement this platform as a bridge, basically, to collect data and pass it to the authorities, the surveillance agencies, and just to facilitate the implementation of the law, basically, and enforcement, and to make sure that we have a special independent platform to observe what's going on in the field and collect data and pass it for them to enforce at the end of the day. That's one thing we try to implement also in Madagascar at the moment. So those are like just a few stuff really I wanted to share. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Gilles, and thanks to all our panelists. You've given us both examples of practical solutions that many of you have you've been involved in implementing them, some cases pioneering them, and they range from, increasing knowledge to moving from linear to circular economies, from engaging businesses in more environmentally sustainable activities in the ocean and coastal zone, and some building on traditional institutions, traditional knowledge, engaging resource users as stewards, working at local level, and finding ways to transmit local understanding and share it across communities, South-South knowledge exchanges, and so on. So there's a whole sort of set of scalable solutions there, and some new horizons, and in some, I think we could say that although there are clear challenges, an investment in this portfolio of solutions tailored to different local circumstances and needs would pay dividends. There are ways of both conserving marine life, restoring marine ecosystems, and improving people's livelihoods, and increasing ecosystem services such that not only the people who directly depend on ocean resources for a livelihood benefit, but all of humanity benefits. The half of humanity that lives close to the coast benefit from an improved environment. The billions of people that consume seafood as part of a nutritious, healthy diet benefit from a diverse and productive environment containing intact, productive ecosystems. And all the intangible benefits that we gain in terms of well-being, as well as the existence values of non-human nature. So all of this can be achieved with the right kind of investment, a conscious understanding that solutions have to have a local dimension as well as a scalable one, and that they have to be integrated with terrestrial conservation, with development processes that span multiple scales. And you've given us some concrete examples of how to implement those kinds of solution strategies. So I want to end now with questions from the audience, and if our panelists would care to sort of address these, we have And I think I won't direct it at anyone. I think anyone who wants to answer the question, please, indicate your interest in doing so. So there's a question from Michael Berger about, is there a role for fair trade or other certifications in helping to merge these agendas, the fair trade agenda and the conservation agenda? Michael, I don't know if I've represented your question fairly, so if you want to chip in and explain further, please do. And while the panelists consider who would like to answer that question. Both David and Beatrice, I think. David, you had your hand up first, I think.
Well, I'll let Beatrice go first, please.
Okay.
Yes, I think this question is very important. Thank you very much, Michael, because what we have now, it's not so fair to small-scale fishers about certification, but I think it's possible to change the way we are treating now this kind of certification. But what I was thinking when you asked this question is what is behind this, because the capitalism see everybody as the same. So small scale fishers and big companies have to have the same the same certification and the same policies and everything. Like here in Brazil, to small scale fishers sell to other state that is not your state, they have to certificate their production, and to do this is very difficult because they have to have a bigger place to benefit everything and to put the official certificate. So they can't sell abroad their state, only in their municipality and inside their state. So we have to discuss a lot before to talk about certification to small scale and to fair trade to these communities.
Thanks, Beatrice. And I think that there is a commission at the moment to look at that issue of how do you allow small-scale fishers to access certification programs that take into account some of the barriers to accessing the existing models, which have high capital costs. So that's a hot area of work at the moment. You wanted to follow that up? Yeah.
Yes, only to close, we have to look different people. So I think the small scale fisheries guidelines that we did on 2014, and it's very important because the guidelines say this, that we have to look to small scale fisheries in a different way. It's only to talk about the guidelines.
Yep. Thank you. David, the sun has set in Mombasa. What do you want to add from your new darkness?
No, I think Beatrice has said it very well. So perhaps we can go to one of the other questions. I think the question is what is fair, and I think really addressing that, and fair to whom, and that the right people are doing the assessment and having their voices heard, I think is critical in all of these certifications.
Thank you. Any other questions, or Michael, would you like to sort of follow up on those responses?
Probably briefly, can you jump in? There's some other questions in the Q&A, one from Jenny related to like hearing how to measure impact of conservation programs with coastal communities in ways to respond to the needs of funders as well as the communities. Gildas, I think you wanted to.
I wanted to respond to the next one, basically. So maybe if David can respond that one first.
Okay, I'll come on that one quickly. And that's a very interesting question. I'll address it around the issue of indicators. And I think it's really important that we use the right indicators around interventions. So those are outcomes. Of course, you have indicators of how well a project has been implemented, but is the fish stocks, are they better than they were before? Is the ecosystem healthier? But also social and economic indicators that make sense locally. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals actually provide a great framework for thinking of a broad base of indicators that can really address what does an intervention mean on the ground that's of interest to the communities, but then from the perspective of the funders, as Jenny has asked, the funders want to know their impact, and this helps to understand what is the impact of their contribution, not just in terms of the environment, but also for people as well. And I think I'd love to get to a model where we have much more of a focus on identifying strong indicators that can be measured, and philanthropy and donations being able to go straight to the ground with good indicators so that impact can be understood a lot better, rather than necessarily having a big sort of a middle role of NGOs and others doing interventions and doing a lot of planning, which also has its own costs. And I think there's a lot of models emerging around doing that now.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And Gildas, you wanted to answer the other question, the role of local and national governments in scalable solutions, in terms of the roles that you'd like to see and how you feel those might be different to the roles that they're currently playing.
Just to talk about what's the role they currently playing or they've played, really. Let's just take the case of Madagascar, where we scale like the solution from 1 to 100 plus communities, is that to facilitate, I guess, the legislation process. They help us on that term. For example, speeding up, let's say, legalization process of those LMMAs or those area under management. Those are very important. But also from, I think it was last year, things like the Minister of Fisheries protecting the right of the local fishers by extending the exclusive zones, for example, trying to put a little bit further the area for industrial fishers, stuff like that. But of course, it is not enough, and that's where we play a lot of role in terms of advocacies, for example, for fishers' rights, because it's too fragile, basically. Yeah, we've seen cases where you have protected areas there, and let's say tourism company come and buy an island, and they easily get it within the protected area, stuff like that. And sometimes it doesn't match their objectives. And we want more in for example, in terms of enforcement of those rules, for the government to take more of to do more of their responsibilities, really. But at the end of the day, it's all about policy. Once you have the right policy and it's implemented, it should work, but that depends a lot on the government authority to make that happen with the right legal framework that community needs to thrive, really. Yeah.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our time, so I'd like to thank all of you who participated in this session, who listened in, who contributed their favorite marine animals and communities that they feel connected to in the ocean, those who ask questions, and to our organizer, excellent organizer from Yale, Juan Villalobos, for getting us together here. And it's been a real privilege and a pleasure for me to listen to Gildas, Beatrice, and David. They all do tremendous work. The organizations that they represent are among the recognized as being among the best, most effective conservation development organizations in the field. That's one of the reasons that they were selected to join this panel. And please join me in thanking them for all the excellent work that they have done and continue to do. And let's support them as best we can. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I wanted to just close with one comment that I think Gildas made, that investing in local communities for conservation and development is the way, because they are closest to the problem and closest to the solution. And I think that's an excellent rationale to take away into our thinking as we sort of think about scaling and high-level policy change and things like that, is to also bear that that very pertinent observation in mind. So thank you very much, everyone. I believe we have a networking event that some of you hopefully will be able to join afterwards. I'm not sure I can, because it's midnight here in Malaysia and I have a flight to catch and a lot of forms to fill in, as those of you who've traveled recently will know. But thank you very much. I'll try and join for a few minutes at least. And see some of you later, and others, good night and thank you.